My name is Ben Burgis. I am the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which is forthcoming in just a couple months from Zer0 Books. And today I would like to talk about Bernie Sanders, socialism, and Venezuela. So as I'm sure anybody who is interested enough in politics to even stumble on this video because it was a recommended video for something else you were watching is perfectly aware. This last week, Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy for the 2020 Democratic nomination. And of course, a lot of people like me are very excited about this. I'm not excited about it because I think that Bernie Sanders is going to usher in a socialist utopia. I'm a Marxist, he's a social democrat. That's a distinction that we're going to get into here. But because I think that he has a real shot this time, and Bernie Sanders being elected president would be a political earthquake of the best possible kind in the barren, miserable landscape of where we're starting out in the United States with 6.7% private sector unionization, and a Democratic Party that's been drifting to the right for decades, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so, big surprise. The 2016 Bernie bro is excited about 2020 Bernie. But of course, a lot of people are not excited about this. And in particular, when they're explaining why they're not excited about this, why in fact they think that a Sanders presidency would be the worst thing ever, a lot of people on the right have a tendency to bring up one country in particular. Let's take a look at a few of those clips.
Now, Venezuelans have a strong message for people who believe in Democrat socialist Bernie Sanders' message. In short, knock it off. Some notable quotes from the video include: Bernie Sanders is your enemy. Do not ever get involved with this individual or any of the other socialists.
But here's the message. There is a message for America's young socialists who now have real power in Congress. And the lesson is, socialism does not work.
Instead of bringing your horrific Marxist ideas to the U.S., why don't you go live a few days in actual socialism?
2 weeks ago, the United States officially recognized the legitimate government of Venezuela and its new president, Juan Guaido. We stand with the Venezuelan people in their noble quest for freedom, and we condemn the brutality of the Maduro regime, whose socialist policies have turned that nation from being the wealthiest in South America into a state of abject poverty and despair. Here in the United States, we are alarmed by the new calls to adopt socialism in our country. America was founded on liberty and independence, and not government coercion, domination, and control. We are born free, and we will stay free.
All right, so how about this? Well, first question that you might ask here, and maybe I'm just being too much of a logic professor that I want to start out by disambiguating all the terms, but a reasonable first question is, what exactly do you mean by socialism? And then once we can pin that down, we can see whether it makes sense to, in fact, blame Venezuela's economic crisis on socialism. And if it's not to be blamed on socialism, what is it to be blamed on? We can get into all of that, at least briefly over the course of this video. So, if you ask people like me, crazy radicals like me, or Doug Lane, Derek Varn, other people you might be familiar with from Zer0 Books, what I would tell you is that socialism is the extension of democracy, from politics to economics through collective ownership and workers' control of the means of production. That it's an entirely new social system, a new phase of history, and that calling Venezuela socialist is just absurd on the face of it. By and large, the Venezuelan economy is in private capitalist hands, just like it always has been. So, what are we even talking about here? But I also realize that a lot of the people that I'm talking to, the people who make the anti-socialist and anti-Bernie Sanders argument from Venezuela, think that that's a cop-out. If they know a little bit about logic, they might say that I'm committing the no true Scotsman fallacy. Now, I addressed that in the video that I did about Stalinism, but I want to kind of take a look at a couple of slightly different angles here. So, I agree with Friedrich Engels or the Irish Marxist James Connolly, both of whom wrote extensively about how they think that it's absurd to equate state ownership per se with socialism, to say that public ownership is only socialist to the extent that the working class controls the state that's owning the means of production. But let's say that's wrong, because you might think, I understand how this works. Anytime real socialism happens and it leads to disaster, you're just going to say that doesn't count. That's not real socialism. Real socialism is just some fairy tale that's never existed, etc., etc. Right? So let's say I'm wrong about that. Let's say that socialism is best understood as just state ownership, or hey, maybe even that big redistributive social entitlements are socialism. Oftentimes, Bernie Sanders talks as if big redistributive social entitlements were socialism. When he says that he's a democratic socialist, and then he pivots to talking about Norway and Finland and Denmark and all of these places, because I would say the same thing about those that I would about Venezuela. That there hasn't been that kind of fundamental reorganization of the economic basis of society in those places. Those are just capitalist countries. What are you talking about? Okay, but let's say I'm wrong about that. So let's say you go with the Bernie Sanders way of using the word socialism, and Bernie will sometimes talk a little bit about workers' cooperatives. That's more of a point of connection between what he means by the S word and what people like me mean by it. But to the extent that he's talking about the Nordic model, then what he is he's a social democrat. So social democracy is more or less a catch-all term for a certain brand of leftist politics with its roots in the socialist tradition that reflects the gradually less and less ambitious goals of traditional socialist parties in Western Europe after World War I, and especially after World War II, and going into the period just before they started abandoning even social democracy, which is about reforms in the interests of the working class within the capitalist system in favor of neoliberalism, which is what happened in a lot of those places. All right, well, here's the problem. Because no matter how you define socialism, and I do think that the way I defined it earlier, I think that that's the best way of using the term. It's the clearest, it's the most explanatory, it's certainly the most historically accurate to how everybody used the term before, on the one hand, the Russian Revolution, and on the other hand, the diminished goals of those traditional socialist parties in Western Europe that I was talking about earlier, watered down the meaning of the term in that Western European context and turned it into something very alien to the extension of democracy in an Eastern European context. So I think that's the right way to use the term, but I don't want to fight too much about terminology because I agree with the late, great philosopher Derek Parfit, who talks in his classic essay, The Unimportance of Identity, about how arguments about higher level facts, about whether something falls under some big sweeping description that people might argue about, Parfit argues, well, that only really matters if the lower level facts that ground those descriptions matter. So, for example, think about two senses in which you might wonder whether you're going to be in pain. One is you've been on lots of boats before, you know you always get seasick, and so you ask, oh, will I be in pain when I'm on the boat? Meaning you're wondering whether the seasickness counts as a kind of pain. That's one kind of issue. Another kind of issue is you're about to go into surgery and you don't know how effective the anesthetics are and you're worried about whether you'll be in pain. And that's the more important kind of issue. So you might say, all right, let's leave aside the semantic argument for a second and just say, hey, is the kind of stuff that Bernie Sanders advocates to blame for what happened in Venezuela such that if we elect him and you know, we do the much more ambitious thing of electing a Congress that would actually pass his agenda, and we deal with obstruction for the courts, et cetera, all the things that would have to happen even to implement social democratic minimum program in the United States. So, you know, we could have national health insurance like one of the big kid countries, for example. Even if all that happens, is that likely to lead us to Venezuela-like disastrous results? And I'd say no, because if what you mean by socialism in that case is government ownership of some of the economy, so Bernie Sanders doesn't want to completely reorganize the economy along the lines of social ownership, but you know, he does want to nationalize the health insurance industry, for example, and you know, a couple of others maybe, you know, but if you think government ownership is the problem, or you even think that an overly generous redistributive welfare state is the problem, here's your issue. There are lots of countries that have gone much further in that direction than Venezuela that aren't experiencing Venezuela-style problems. So, brass tacks. Even in October 2012, according to my source here is the CEPR think tank, October 2012, at the height of Hugo Chavez's welfare state, before all the austerity that's happened in the several years since then, even at that point, only 18% of the Venezuelan workforce worked for the public sector. Compare that to the United States at 14%. So is that the difference between socialism and capitalism, 14% versus 18%? That's a little funny to start out with, but even funnier is that France is 22%. So, look, I don't think it makes sense to talk about degrees of socialism. I think that socialism is a fundamental qualitative reorganization of the foundations of society economically, and so it doesn't really make sense to talk about more socialist or less socialist. But if you want to equate socialism with state ownership, and you want to equate, and you think that it comes in degrees, so we could talk about more socialist or less socialist, then France is just as much more socialist than Venezuela as Venezuela is more socialist than the United States. And Norway is way more socialist than either one. Norway, as of 2012, that figure was 29% of the workforce worked for the public sector. So this is pretty funny. And by the way, I want to make sure to give credit's due for where I'm getting a lot of this. Besides the CEPR post, Triple P, People's Policy Project, Matt Brunig has written extensively about this. I think Brunig, I'm not always crazy about the way he frames the argument, because he's not the same kind of socialist that I am, so he often, frames it in terms of really insisting, oh yeah, Norway, Finland, Denmark, these are socialist countries, right? Norwegians live under socialism, and I don't agree with that. But you can reconstruct his argument to leave out that premise. You can just say, look, socialism either means what Marxists say it means, or it means what right-wingers say it means, or it means this, or it means this, or it means this. And on any definition, you can't get the result that Venezuela is socialist without also getting the result that lots of European countries that are doing way better than Venezuela right now are not socialist. Whether it's size of welfare state, percentage of economy under state ownership, whatever. Brett Stevens, a New York Times column where he was pushing this argument from Venezuela, said, really, he mentioned, what he brought up was all of these workers' cooperatives. So sometimes in the Chavez era, when leftists in other countries were more enthusiastic about Venezuela, including me, not because I thought it was socialist, but because I thought that they'd stood up to U.S. imperialism and achieved all of these important social democratic reforms within a democratic system politically, and that was impressive, and that was worth having solidarity with. Since then, it's become much more authoritarian, and also they've backed away from some of the level of social democratic ambitiousness. But in any case, way back when a lot of leftists were more enthusiastic about Venezuela, oftentimes they bring up all the workers' cooperatives. So Brett Stevens bring up, they have, X number of workers' cooperatives. That sounds like a lot. But here's the thing. If you add up those numbers, at least when I was preparing for this, doing a little back of the napkin math, that's like 3% of the Venezuelan workforce works for workers' cooperatives. It's a tiny percentage on the periphery of the economy. If you count employee stock ownership plans, companies that are probably where the bulk of the shares of the company are held by an ESOP, the number is higher in the United States than it is in Venezuela. So that's not going to get you the result that Venezuela is more socialist than the United States, much less lots of European countries like Spain, where they have Mondragon, which is a major employer. It's a workers' cooperative. That's a big workers' cooperative, or kind of a federation of workers' cooperatives. And in general, it really starts to look like no matter how you define socialism, right? And this has nothing to do with my ideas about what socialism is, but just anybody's ideas about what socialism is, you are not going to get this result that the countries Bernie likes to talk about aren't socialist, but Venezuela is socialist. Not going to happen. So that leaves us with two questions. One of them is, what is the cause of Venezuela's crisis? Now, a lot of people who really emphasize anti-imperialism will emphasize the role of U.S. economic warfare against Venezuela, which is a real thing. A lot of other people with different perspectives, including, some left-wing commentators, will emphasize currency mismanagement. And also, I think that there are left-wing critics who are not at all apologists for, U.S. imperialist meddling in Venezuela, who do have very plausible things to say about corruption and mismanagement, especially in the Maduro government. All right. And, just to be clear, I think that there are lots of things that should be criticized about the corruption of the Maduro government, about the mismanagement of the Maduro government, about the very authoritarian turn that was taken after the economy collapsed. All of these are fair criticisms, but none of that means that I don't 100% oppose the U.S.-sponsored coup attempt. Donald Trump does not get to pick the president of Venezuela. Anybody who knows anything about the history of U.S.-sponsored coups in Latin America should be 100% opposed to this. There's no way that if this was successful, it would make Venezuela better or more democratic. It would make it worse and more authoritarian. That is a take it to the bank certainty. So coups bad. But Venezuela, not socialist. So, last question. What should we think about Bernie Sanders? Well, I've indicated that I think we need a much more robust socialist vision, one that really gets down to the economic foundations of how our society is organized. But I really do think that the Sanders campaign is a good first step, and I think a successful Sanders campaign will be a huge shot in the arm to the socialist movement and would really open up space for something even to the left of that, even to the left of Sanders-style social democracy to start to emerge after there were more of those victories for that kind of social democratic minimum program. All of which is to say, is Bernie Sanders going to turn the United States into Venezuela in terms of level of social democratic meddling with the natural laws of capitalism? Hey, I hope he goes even further than Venezuela and turns us into one of those crazily socialist countries like France or Norway. Obviously, I'm kidding. I don't think he alone can do that. I think that even implementing the Sanders program would be a huge uphill struggle, but it's a struggle that's very much worth engaging in, and let's ignore all of the nonsense like the argument from Venezuela.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.